Hey friends, so in this video I want to talk about the gospel reading from the Gospel of Matthew for the first week of Advent in lectionary cycle year A. So that gospel text is Matthew 24:36 to 44, which says, "But about that day and hour no one knows, neither the angel of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. For as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in the days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. So too will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then two will be in the field, one will be taken, one will be left. Two women will be grinding meal together, one will be taken, and one will be left. Keep awake, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect." So this passage that we have for the first week of Advent comes as part of a larger discourse in the Gospel of Matthew that is often referred to as the Judgment Discourse. That's Matthew 23 to 25. And so throughout these whole two chapters, Jesus is essentially talking about this kind of coming judgment, like what we hear in this passage. In terms of the larger literary structure of Matthew, this is actually pretty important because this judgment discourse is the fifth of five major discourses in Matthew. And those are really significant to the way that the Gospel of Matthew presents Jesus, because uh, these five major discourses, these five major sections of teaching in Matthew, well, they're sort of reminiscent of uh, somebody else in the biblical story, right? If you think about, well, what other teacher in Israel's history was credited with five major discourses, right? And it's Moses. That you have the five books of Moses: the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, right? The Torah, or sometimes known as the Pentateuch, that are typically credited to Moses. And of course, Moses is the great lawgiver um, in uh, in Israel's history. And so this is part of this very structure of the Gospel of Matthew. It's not just an accident. It's not that Matthew is just kind of going along, just sort of telling the story of Jesus in the order that it happened, or in the order that in the order that these events took place, but that Matthew is intentionally structuring his gospel to present Jesus in a particular way, particularly to present Jesus as this new Moses, right? So you have these five large blocks of teaching material, the first of which, by the way, is the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew. And I mean, that really makes the Moses parallel even more unmistakable, right? Because Jesus goes up on a mountain in order to begin to teach the people, just as Moses went up on the mountain to receive the law on Mount Sinai from God. And so, and there are actually a number of other elements we could point to in the Gospel of Matthew in the ways that Jesus is presented as this new Moses. But these five blocks of teaching material in the Gospel of Matthew is a structure that is unique to Matthew and helps present Jesus as this new Moses. That Jesus is essentially a Jewish rabbi who is delivering instruction on God's law. And so again, this passage is in the last of those five, because after this, as soon as this judgment discourse, that fifth major block of teaching material concludes, now we're going to start to move into Holy Week, essentially, into Christ's Passion. He's going to enter into Jerusalem and start to be in controversy with the religious leaders there that will eventually lead to his arrest and crucifixion and death. And so this is the last one of those five major blocks as the gospel story is headed in that direction. Just a little side note here, that this particular passage that we're looking at within that larger block of material is what's known as Q material. And that means that it is in both Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. If you're going, what in the world is Q material? Well, I made another whole video just about that. so that I wouldn't have to go into detail in every one of these videos on the passages themselves. So if you're wondering what that's all about, I encourage you to go watch the other video on the synoptic problem, and we'll explain what that means. But the shorthand of it is that it means that this passage is shared between Matthew and Luke, but it is not in the Gospel of Mark. And so they are probably both borrowing from this common source that scholars often refer to as Q. Now, in terms of what this passage is about, I think the message of the passage is actually relatively simple, and that's what I've highlighted here in this red text to hopefully get your attention. I think the meaning of the passage can essentially be summed up in the first and last verse of this passage, right? Verse 36 and verse 44. About that day and hour, that this judgment is going to take place, that the Son of Man is going to come. No one knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. And then at the end, in verse 44, you have this refrain, therefore you must also be ready, right? So, I think that is kind of the main idea of this passage, and you see here in verse 42 the admonition to keep awake, right? That's the main point here, is that the admonition of the passage is about remaining ready because you don't know when Jesus is going to return. You don't know when the judgment that is talked about in this block of teaching material is going to take place. No one knows except the Father. And so there's this call to be sort of perpetually ready, right? To always to keep awake, to stay alert, to pay attention, because you don't know when God's kingdom is going to finally come in its fullness, and you don't want to sort of be caught off guard. So I think that that's the main idea, and of course I think that's the reason this gospel text is chosen for the first week of the season of Advent, right? Because it's very fitting for the season of Advent. Advent is a season about waiting, about expectation, about anticipation of what is to come, right? In the season of Advent, we are looking forward to Christ coming, to his birth at Christmas, right? And so even though in the gospel story, this is obviously after Jesus' birth because he's speaking these words, that sense of expectation, anticipation, I think is appropriate for that first week of the season of Advent. And so in a lot of ways, the whole season of Advent is this call to wait, but it's not a passive waiting, right? It's not just, oh, I'm just kind of waiting around killing time. It's this anticipatory, expectant waiting, right? A sort of almost on the edge of your seat kind of waiting, that you're leaning into the future as you wait for it to come. And I think that's what this passage sort of communicates, right? Now, around those main ideas, you have several what you might almost kind of think of as like sermon illustrations, right? That Jesus says, the coming of the Son of Man is going to be like the days of Noah. And you see, I've got a little painting for you there of the deluge, certain artistic representation of the flood. Says, for as the days of Noah were, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. That they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving marriage until the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. So you see again, the emphasis is on the suddenness and the unpredictability, the unexpectedness, right, is what's being communicated with this flood imagery. That people were just going about their normal everyday lives when suddenly the flood came, and the only person who survives, or the only people who survive, are Noah's family, who was prepared, right? Because they were expecting, waiting what God had commanded. And then it gives another example. Two will be in the field, one will be taken, and one will be left. Two women will be grinding meal together, one will be taken, and one will be left. So again, there is this emphasis on there's this unpredictability, right? You don't know when this is going to happen. And then the sort of final analogy is, if the owner of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into, right? But again, the sense is you don't know. You don't know when the thief is coming. And so you have to have a sort of constant vigilance, right? Now, in this case, the metaphors get mixed a little bit because the owner of the house can't stay awake perpetually, right? But if he had known, he would have stayed awake. And so there is this call to keep awake in the sense of continually being ready. And so I think that's the main idea of what's being communicated in this passage, and is a fitting way to start off the season of Advent. So now that I've said what I think this passage is about, I want to say just a little bit about what I don't think it's about, and that's what I've got down here um, in this section right here. That depending on your background and like sort of what your experience with Christianity has been, and the sort of parts of the Christian tradition you've been exposed to, you may look at a passage like this, and the first thing that comes to mind might be rapture. Actually, because of my own upbringing, that's something I sort of initially see in the text, and I have to work to notice that it's not actually there. Some of you may be wondering, well, what in the world is rapture? Maybe you've never even heard that term before. So the rapture is a belief that is held by some Christians that Christians will suddenly and secretly be taken to heaven before God's final judgment on earth, based on a particular reading of 1 Thessalonians 4, Revelation 11, and passages from the Gospels like this one. Now, I want to emphasize that the rapture is not sort of official Christian doctrine. It's not sort of officially recognized by the Church of the Nazarene. If you go read our article of faith about the coming of Christ and the establishment of the kingdom, you'll notice rapture is not mentioned there, right? So this is, even though it is a commonly held belief among a good number of Christians and among a number of Nazarenes even, it is not a part of our official doctrine. And that reading, that understanding, the idea of rapture, that like that before the final judgment comes, God is going to secretly rapture, secretly just take all the Christians out of the world. You'll notice that, well, to just put it very simply, like that's not said here in this particular passage, right? Now, some people will look at this passage and see the part about there'll be two in the field and one will be taken and one will be left, and they'll go, aha, see, that's rapture. Like God is going to take one person out of the world to save them, and the other person's going to be left behind to that judgment. I would just simply have us notice that Matthew doesn't spell that out, right? And I'd also have us notice that Matthew actually doesn't even make it clear whether you want to be taken or whether you want to be left, right? It's actually not clear whether being taken is good or being left is good. So if we follow the analogy of Noah and the ark, for example, which is the dominant metaphor in this passage, you could ask yourself, well, in Noah's situation, does being taken mean you were taken by the flood and therefore died? Or does being taken mean you got taken on the ark, right? So it's not actually clear which way the metaphor even works. So that idea of rapture is not sort of inherent to this passage of Matthew. You have to go to 1 Thessalonians 4 and read that passage in a certain way, and go to Revelation 11 and read that passage in a certain way, and read this passage and other gospel passages in a certain way, and sort of put all those together as if Scripture were a jigsaw puzzle, and you have to fit the pieces together in order to come to this understanding of rapture. So, I mean, I'll just go out on a limb here and say I personally don't regard rapture as a strictly biblical idea. I think you can find it there if you already have the idea and you go sort of looking for it in different places. But I think it actually stretches the meaning of what's being talked about here in Matthew, where the main point is you just don't know when the judgment is coming. And to be clear, this passage is talking about judgment. I think that comes through very clearly, and that we don't know when it's happening, and that some will be spared from it and some will endure it. But there's not this sort of intricate scheme of rapture. And so just very quickly, you'll notice here that I put the picture of a guy named John Nelson Darby from the 1800s. I put him here because John Nelson Darby was actually the one who popularized this idea of rapture. Really put the first one to put it forward, at least in this particular way. And his idea of rapture was really popularized through something called the Scofield Reference Bible. You might maybe even have a copy of this, or you might find one of them laying around your church or something like that. They were very popular in the United States for a time, and it was the footnotes, the sort of chain references in the Scofield Reference Bible that really popularized John Nelson Darby's idea, because when you read 1 Thessalonians 4, for example, it would point you to a Revelation 11 and to passages like this in the gospel and encourage you to connect them, and then it would have a little note and sort of explain like why those things should be connected. So I've just included John Nelson Darby here for us to see that this is actually a relatively recent idea in Christian history, this idea of rapture. It's not something that's been there like since the beginning. It's not something you find the church fathers talking about. It was really popularized just a couple hundred years ago in a specifically American context. So just want to make that historical note that as you think about this passage, I'd encourage you to reflect on what is actually stated in this passage and what's not stated, and to try to be as true to the gospel text as you can be. All right, so as we come to the end of this video here, oh, sorry, I'm trying to get this to go away. Oh, I'm having trouble with my tools again. We might kind of ask ourselves, I cannot get it to unselect that. There we go. Okay. We might kind of ask ourselves, well, where's the hope in this, right? All this talk of judgment, and the theme of the first week of Advent is supposed to be hope, right? It's the theme of the first week of Advent, and we might say, well, where is the hope in the midst of all this judgment, right? We've got all this talk of destruction and the flood, and this comes in the midst of this judgment discourse in the Gospel of Matthew. How are we supposed to find hope in this? What is the hope in this? And how do we maintain this posture of hope as we enter in the season of Advent? And for me, I think the hope here is that, yes, there's all this judgment, and that's not great and encouraging, but it does signal that God is not done with creation, but is in fact accomplishing a new Exodus, right? That Matthew presents Jesus as this new Moses, and that through Jesus, a new Exodus, a new redemption, a new release from slavery is being accomplished in Jesus' life and death and resurrection. And so, yes, there is all this talk of judgment, and I think we have to be very thoughtful about the way that we handle that. But that judgment, that there is a certain level of hope in that judgment, because it means that God is not done redeeming his creation, right? After all, that was what the flood was all about. As awful as the flood was, as terrible as the amount of death and destruction that it brought was, the point of the flood was ultimately a redemption of creation, right? And I think that's the framework in which we should think about this judgment passage at the beginning of the season of Advent as well. I actually think of another story in the Gospel of Matthew, the story of the wheat and the tares, right? This parable that Jesus tells in Matthew 13, where one of the servants is out in the field and sees that there's tares, there's weeds growing up with the wheat, right? And the servant says to the master, "Do you want us to go tear out the weeds so that the wheat can grow?" And the owner of the field says, "No, just let it grow, and we'll separate it at the harvest, because if you try and tear it out now, you'll damage the wheat, right? You'll damage the crop. And so we'll let them grow together, and we'll just separate them at the end." And I think that same sort of sense is communicated in a passage like this one, that as we look around our world, we see all kinds of evil, right? We see all kinds of weeds that corrupt God's good creation. And we might wonder to ourselves, why does God let that stuff go on? Does it mean God's never going to do anything about it? And I think this passage and that parable of the wheat and the weeds is a way of saying, like, no, God's work is not done. Hope is not lost. God is still going to separate out the things that corrupt God's creation, and God is still going to redeem God's creation, and in fact that work has begun through the ministry and life of Jesus Christ. But there is this sense in which they have to grow together for a time. But the hope is found in the fact that God is not done, that God is still going to do this work. And so I think a passage like this one in this first week of Advent calls on us as Christ followers to maintain a posture of hope, even in the midst of the chaos, right? Just as Noah had to maintain this posture of hope in the midst of the flood that he knew was coming, just as the owner of the field had to maintain a posture of hope about his crop, even as there were weeds growing up with the wheat, right? In the same way, we as followers of Jesus are called upon to maintain this posture of hope, this posture of awareness, of awakeness, of readiness, even in the midst of the chaos of our own world. And so I think that's a good way for us to begin the season of Advent in this first week, is to think about that hope is not just turning a blind eye to the things that corrupt our world. It is staring them dead on, seeing that they're there, and saying that, I'm choosing hope anyway. That hope is a choice. That it is a particular posture towards the future. That even though I see these weeds that are growing up in our world, I'm going to stay awake. I'm going to stay ready because I know that God's work in the world is not